I want to start with something, it's not our usual starting point, but given that the Senate started an impeachment trial today, I want to touch base with you about your vote on the articles of impeachment in the House. You voted present. What was the message there? What were you trying to...
Taking a very specific stand for the center in pointing out the hyperpartisanship in Washington, how divided our country is and has become, and how important it is for us to be able to both hold the president accountable while also not further tearing our country apart, which is why I also introduced a censure resolution that included what I believe are many more of the abuses and acts of wrongdoing that this president has done, and I think that would have more likely been able to get bipartisan support than what we've seen so far. Look, I think that this whole process has and is continuing to only harden and increase Trump's support. I think it's very likely that we will see House Democrats lose some, if not many, seats, potentially ceding the House to Republicans. And I think if we end up in a situation where we have a re-elected Donald Trump and a Republican Senate and a Republican House, I think that would be disastrous for the country. So I'm obviously running to defeat Trump and remove him from office. I think that the most powerful way that we as a country can do that is with voters making their voices heard at the ballot box.
Okay. So there are a lot of candidates in the Democratic side of this race, and we've talked with a number of them. Everybody has some big plans, and those big plans come with big price tags.
Yes.
So our national debt is in the 23 trillion range. How important is it to address that? Can we just keep borrowing?
No. How we pay for things really does matter.
Okay.
And I think that's really a question that is on voters' minds a lot as they think in their own lives about, okay, well, we've got a budget for things and you've got so much coming in and so much going out, and how do you make it work? I think that's been a recurring issue in this campaign, as there are, as you mentioned, many grand plans that are being laid out with hefty price tags, but no one really talking about the central point that unless we deal with how much of our money is being spent and going out the door to pay for more wasteful, unnecessary wars, regime change wars, new Cold War, nuclear arms race, we can't even begin to have the conversation about how we're going to pay for the things that we need in our communities right here at home. Afghanistan, case in point, the Afghanistan papers revealed a whole lot about how for 3 administrations now, leaders have been questioning what is this even for? What are we trying to accomplish? Recognizing that this is essentially a failed mission, yet we're continuing to spend $4 billion every month in Afghanistan. $4 billion every month. That's $5.5 million per hour. That's what roughly 6 weeks in Afghanistan could pay for New Hampshire's annual appropriations. So when you put it within the context of how much is going out to pay for unnecessary and wasteful wars, regime change wars, nation building, all of these things, and the very real needs we have here at home, this is why I've made this issue the central point of my campaign. Because otherwise, everything else it remains a question mark.
Sure. So we're going to talk about paying for specific projects and programs, but staying with the deficit.
Yes.
Obviously, if we were not paying for some of our military excursions, that would save some money. What other policies or initiatives do you have that would address the deficit specifically?
I think it's really taking that look across the federal government, across every agency and department, And just as I would advocate for us doing within the Department of Defense and saying, okay, well, we have troops stationed in 800 places around the world. What objective is it serving? Is it actually serving our country's interests? Similarly, we should do that same kind of audit across our federal government. It's something that I've seen just over the time that I've been in Congress, and there's bipartisan support for this to actually go through line by line, looking whether it's in HUD or education or agriculture, where are those areas that are either no longer serving a legitimate purpose or not actually achieving the objective that they need to achieve. We see how these bills are passed every year, and a lot of these things coming in the dark of night or in the last minute appropriations where not everyone really knows what's actually in the bill. All of Congress, working with the executive branch, needs to take a more active role in being responsible caretakers for taxpayer dollars.
I was just curious on that, and I think one of the things you brought to the conversation of the race is whether we should rethink our kind of projection as a superpower around the world. What do you think of, whether it's like bases we still have in Western Europe or, more remote locations? We have like 14,000 troops in Kuwait that often doesn't get counted when we talk about how many troops are still in Iraq.
That's right.
Compared to, the Chinese military is suddenly establishing bases in places like Djibouti and making whole islands up to have armies. Are you worried at all about, whatever influence we were to cede, that potentially there could be, something worse coming into that vacuum?
I'm not advocating for isolationism. I'm really advocating for us taking a very focused look at our decision-making process about where and when our troops are both serving in harm's way or just the overall expenses we have with the Department of Defense. Where we're spending right now with our defense budget more than China, Russia, the UK, and Germany all combined. We're spending more than that, and we taxpayers deserve to know what are we getting for what we're spending. I'm still a soldier serving the Army National Guard, and I understand both through that personal experience, now for serving almost 17 years, as well as my 2 deployments in the Middle East, my time in Congress, very focused on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services and Homeland Security Committees, how critical our national security is, and ensuring that our decisions are both meeting those national security objectives, as well as making sure we're not unnecessarily wasting taxpayer dollars or unnecessarily putting our troops' lives at risk. And I think this issue is one that touches every other issue, is central to every other issue that we face. And the unique experience I bring to this is really more than every other candidate, probably except Joe Biden combined, really understanding and having a depth in these issues of national security and foreign policy.
Just circling back to the deficit
Yes.
Briefly, but a big driver, at least in the last couple of years, in the increase has been tax cuts from the president's tax bill. So do you see finding the money for your programs just through the military reductions, or
No.
are you going to have
That
to?
wouldn't be enough.
So where else is it coming from?
Yeah, like I said, it's looking across our federal government, being more fiscally responsible in how we're spending taxpayer dollars. And I think reforming the tax code has to play a very central role in this. I thought it was very telling that as this tax bill was moving through Congress, really there was no answer to that question of, well, how do you pay for these massive tax credits that are largely going to big corporations? It was kind of silence, crickets in the room. And really what we've seen is how the crony capitalism had influenced largely the outcome of that bill, and how those serious loopholes are being exploited by some of the largest corporations, leaving a lot of small business owners I meet here across New Hampshire scratching their heads wondering how it is that they're paying their taxes every year and these largest corporations are getting by with paying absolutely nothing. So really looking across our tax code and making sure that it is one that is truly fair, that everyone is paying their fair share, I think would provide a serious amount of funding to being able to go for both reducing the debt and also making sure that we're meeting the needs of our people.
And what does that mean on the individual tax side of things? I hear your concerns about business taxes.
Yeah.
But what does it mean for individual rates when you say fairness?
That's something that I'm working with different economists and tax experts to figure out what would that fair look be for those who are working, making under 30 grand, 50, 75, over all the different income brackets that we have, and seeing what adjustments need to be made there to make sure that there is a fair tax level for everyone.
So obviously the debate spent a lot of time on healthcare, but it's in a more condensed format. So if you want to maybe elaborate more on
that's putting it kindly.
Yeah, especially you definitely had a bone to pick with the amount of time you're getting. So
right, exactly.
So we got to hear no green light, yellow light, red light.
Yeah.
So you have room for private insurance
yes.
In your Medicare for All plan.
Yeah, that's something that. Sorry to cut you off.
No.
I think that's something that I think I take a more sensible approach rather than the two extremes that we've seen in a lot of the debates.
So, well, I guess one, just as a semantic matter, why call it Medicare for All if it also has private insurance? When the other ones don't?
My plan, I call it a single payer plus plan.
Okay.
And I've really taken a look at a lot of the different developed countries that have some form of universal health care, single payer, or other versions, and have modeled mine loosely after Australia's healthcare plan. Where every single person has they call it Medicare, has their Medicare cards. You've got guaranteed quality health care for every single person, while still allowing people, obviously, the option if they want to purchase into private insurance, supplementary insurance, and if they have nonprofit insurance providers there, that leaves the opportunity for people to be empowered to make the best healthcare decisions they want to for themselves and their families.
So another thing we always ask candidates on this is, when it comes to Medicare reimbursement rates and sort of issues that, more rural populations have, what are you thinking if this kind of overhaul were to happen about how you'd want to tinker with that?
I think the point is that the system needs more than just a little bit of tinkering. I've talked with some folks who love Medicare, and I've talked with some folks who just are so frustrated by the donut holes and the low reimbursement rates that they're not able to get into the doctors they want to see because they're not taking any more Medicare patients. So I think I look at this from instead of tinkering around the edges of the current system, really look at how can we best provide people with that peace of mind that whether you're, a young mother with 3 kids and working 2 jobs, that if your child gets sick, you're going to be able to get that care and the medicine that they need. Or if you're someone who's living on a fixed income, that you're going to be able to get the medicine that you need. So I think it's looking at the holes and the problems that we have within the current Medicare system, but then also obviously dealing with what I think is the biggest flaw of the current system we have, which is big insurance and big pharma really are holding the reins in driving up largely the biggest drivers of increasing cost of health care, and things like Medicare not being able to negotiate lower prescription drug price, I think, is one of those egregious examples. So my view is they should not have a role to play in actually forming this guaranteed quality health care for everyone. But I also think that it's not the right choice to say, well, we're going to just completely shut out this industry altogether. I think people ultimately have the rights and freedom to make their own choices.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to a lot of your supporters on the trail, and often they're at events for other candidates, and they say, I'm for Tulsi, but I'm checking out this person. A lot of them said they voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary, and he's pretty upfront about, he thinks, when we spoke to him, that there's kind of a pretty much corrupt, nefarious, motive going on with the private insurance industry, and that he thinks just on a principle of universality, we should all be in the same plan. I mean, why do you think there should still be that room for private insurance? And if they are the culprit of all this wrongdoing, what does the public option do to keep them in check?
Well, I think that it's important, first of all, that this is not a public option. This is guaranteed health care for everyone. And not taking away people's right to choose to purchase into an insurance plan if they would like. The second thing is, if you look at every other developed country in the world, every single one of them, no matter what kind of healthcare system they have, there is some role of private insurance. So it's to say that the two can't coexist is actually false. Look, I think that the greed-driven system that we have now is hugely problematic, but I also think that government shouldn't be taking away people's rights to make their own choices.
So when you're talking about a single payer plus,
Yeah.
so the single payer, to be clear, would be the government. I mean, they would be running this expansive program that everybody could be part of, or would
That everyone,
be part
well,
of
I mean, look, it's
to a degree.
every one of us paying into this system. I think that's really the definition there of single payers, us all contributing at different levels into this healthcare system. But just as with Medicare, it's not a government, it's not like the VA,
Okay.
for example.
So it's not Medicare. In the
Just
sense where
as with
the
Medicare.
CMS is running everything.
Right, correct.
So when you say it's everybody is paying into this, the same way people pay premiums now?
Except we'll be able to pay less. We'll be
Okay.
able to pay less because we're not dealing with this huge overhead cost that big insurance currently has, and the ability that they have to jack up their premiums and leave the many people with such high deductibles that even though they think they're quote unquote covered, they're not actually able to get the care that they need when they need it because they can't afford it.
Okay, and so who would be running it? I mean, there's got to be some framework there, right?
Yeah.
And if the large insurers, Anthem and Cigna and whoever if their presence in the marketplace is being winnowed some, who is overseeing that everything operates the way it's supposed to, and that people are being billed properly, and that drug prices are not obscenely high and all of that?
I think the details of this need to be worked out as we have to work with Congress. You know, if I were to sit here and tell you that here is the 3,000-page bill that I'm going to push forward in Congress, that's not how it works. It's really going to take a lot of collaboration with leaders in Congress to be able to work out exactly how this works out. I think when we look at the system that Medicare distinct from the VA, for example, and I think this is where there's a lot of misconceptions about a government-run healthcare system, meaning you have to go to a government-run hospital and I'm going to tell you who your doctor has to be and so on and so forth. That's not what I'm referring to here. That we have essentially, it's a Medicare for all type system, but I think it's not just looking at the Medicare system that we have now and expanding it. I think it's looking at it and seeing what's working, what's not, improving upon it, and making sure that once again everyone can go. If you want to go see your doctor, you'll be able to go and see your doctor, and understanding that you'll have more certainty in knowing exactly what you're paying and what you're getting.
Okay. So since we're on the topic of health, you, as you noted, have spent a lot of time here in New Hampshire over the past few months, and you know that the opioid crisis is kind of a big thing.
It's huge.
Here, as elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so a lot of candidates we have spoken to over the past several years at various levels of government talk about, well, we've got to get more money for this, and we've got to get more money, and our congressional leaders tout the money that they've managed to negotiate through Congress. So then you have that money, and what do you do with it? What are your priorities in figuring out where it goes and what needs to happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is literally why I've appreciated so much being able to spend time here, in going and visiting recovery centers and recovery homes, speaking with both providers as well as people who are working their way through recovery now, is to get that feedback about where the shortages and where are the gaps. So much of the focus is, and I think rightly so, on making sure that those recovery beds are available for those who are in that place of urgent and emergency in their need. There has been a big shortage. I know there's a big shortage, especially for women, by several multiples, where there are not nearly enough beds to be able to serve all those who need them. So it's that immediate care, and then it's the follow-on care. I've visited, some of the recovery homes, and I've started talking about funding and how do you fund it. And really what many of them have shared is that they're only able to take in people who have the good insurance, private insurance, to be able to pay for it. So for those who are working their way through recovery but don't have the benefit of good private insurance, their options are very, very limited to be able to go down that, what is often a very long path towards recovery, trying to put their lives back together, trying to think about a place to live, a place to work, and all of the different things needed. But I think I spoke to a gentleman a couple of days ago who is now 4 years sober. He started a small business and is doing landscaping, and now hires people specifically who are also in recovery to try to help them. But he made a comment that I thought was really pointed and is often not talked about, which is that even those, including himself, as they are going down this path of recovery, the pain that drove them to this addiction in the first place is often still there and not addressed. And really dealing with the mental health crisis and the extreme shortage in people who are able to help provide that care, both in mental health professionals, but also in recognizing, and I've seen this with some of my friends who've come back from multiple deployments and who are facing serious pain and trauma, both visible and invisible, and having many different treatment modalities that might work for one but not work for another. And so this gentleman I spoke to, he chose to start a landscaping business because he finds his peace in working with plants. That's his kind of spiritual place of growth and peace. For others who I've met in Hawaii, of course, it's getting out in the ocean, being able to spend time with nature. Others, it's working with dogs or with horses. And so I think the real thing here is actually seeing how we as a country can best support addressing the root cause of the problem that's driving this epidemic to increase. Obviously, this is something many of us are focusing on, as well as the accountability measures for, Purdue Pharma and these big opioid producers for the role that they have to play in this. But for recovery, I think we've got to look at this from a very holistic perspective. And again, resources. There are not nearly enough resources being put towards this.
And so there needs to be a pretty significant financial component to this.
Yes.
Through Medicaid reimbursements or the like, or expanding mandated coverage under. How much additional investment do you think this might require?
I don't want to use an arbitrary number, because I think we've got to really look at, again, how we're going to be able to deal with the root cause of these problems and the many stages that people are working their way through recovery. I think that, yes, this will require expanded care and more resources. Part of that comes from us through our healthcare system. But I think we also need to hold these big pharmaceutical companies accountable in getting them to pay up to deal with the damage and the devastation that they've caused in people's lives.
I was just wondering, from your time in Washington, I mean, we ostensibly have mental health parity. It's on the books, but you talk to any provider, and it doesn't exist in reality.
No.
What's your understanding of how that persists? Like, how is that possible?
Unfortunately, it's something that I think is talked about, but really just not followed through on. And I think there's the resource shortage as a result of that, but then there's just also still the stigma that is very real still. I've seen it and experienced it in the military and in the VA, and have seen it in just the civilian sector, that if you're someone who needs mental health care, then somehow something wrong with you, or screws loose, or this or that. I mean, this is generations long, and there's not a government mandate solution to that. I think this is something that we as a society need to come together and just recognize whole health care, physical and mental health care.
Yeah. So, I mean, you already kind of touched on the need for some sort of pragmatism depending on what Congress looks like.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, so assuming that Mitch McConnell is still the Senate Majority Leader, how do you want to tackle that, I guess? Do you think of repealing the filibuster? Are there things you think budget reconciliation to be stretched for? That's something that Senator Sanders and more recently Senator Warren have talked about is, hey, look, the Republicans did this to us. They ran a bunch of stuff through. What's stopping us if we have the majority or if Mitch McConnell's still in place from going that route? I'm wondering what you think being in the other chamber all these years.
I think this is a good discussion that we should have. I just think it's not constructive to have this discussion through a partisan lens. And I've been there long enough to see, the Senate change hands, and you will see that the party in the minority is the one that's pushing for these reforms. And once the power shifts again, then they're not really quite so vocal in calling for those same changes, for I think obvious reasons. So I think they're very important questions that we should have about how Congress can better break through the gridlock, can better break through this hyperpartisanship. I just think we've got to find a way to be able to do it, to really think about what's in the best interest of the country so that no party is in a position where they can ramrod their stuff through, their legislation through, without the checks and balances that I think our founders envisioned the House and the Senate to be for each other.
So is there a policy that if you were really getting stonewalled, that you think this is the top thing I can fight for the American people, that you'd be willing to break that?
I don't. Again, I think this is about recognizing that we've got to be able to find a way to work together as a country. And it's not easy, it's not fast, it's very frustrating at times. But once you get into a place where you're just saying, well, you know what, they're not doing this, so as president, whether through executive authority or through this or through that, I'm just going to break my way through, then I think we're violating the very principle of this system of governance that we have. I'm not saying there shouldn't be some reforms. I'm just saying we've got to be able to do it through a more pragmatic lens and not one that is only invoked when I want to get what I want or when my party wants to get what they want.
I see.
Do you feel the same about executive powers and the separation of the legislative and executive branches? And we've seen over the past decade or so, President Obama was sworn in and Mitch McConnell said, we're going to do everything we can to stop anything he tries to do. And eventually he took some steps through the power of the presidency that may have been overreach. We've seen that go the other way under Donald Trump.
What do you mean go the other way?
It's the one article he mentions, Article 2.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
That he has arguably overreached his authority, in war powers and other areas. And you could easily make an argument from a conservative side that the Democrats in Congress have not wanted to go along with his agenda, whether that's warranted or not. So you see this kind of back and forth, and it seems that the power of the presidency is being abused. So you're on one side of this, you've been there for all of that. If you were on the other side of it, how would you view working with Congress, or if you weren't getting your way, if Mitch McConnell is defeating everything or not even bringing bills to the floor of the Senate that you think need to be heard, how do you use your authority as president?
Carefully, really, very carefully. And you're right. I mean, there has been executive overreach across both party lines and for a very long time, and it feels like increasingly so. And when I talk a lot about this in our town halls every single day about the hyperpartisanship in Washington, and the hypocrisy that goes on, that when it's my party that's in the White House, it's okay, but as soon as it's the other party, we'll turn a blind eye. If it's my party, then it's a green light. But if it's the other party, then it's calling out, well, this is terrible, overreach and everything else. So you see a double standard in place, when really the standard should be the constitutional authorities that are set out between Congress and the executive branch. I having to do with the War Powers Act specifically, I introduced bipartisan legislation called the No More Presidential Wars Act to address both of these issues, which the responsibility not only lies in the hands of the presidency on this, it also lies within the hands of Congress to exercise its constitutional authority and not continue to cede these powers to the executive, because members of Congress don't want to be put on the record or don't want to have to make that tough decision in some cases.
So a year from now, almost to the day, when you become president, what concrete steps can you take to reduce that hyperpartisanship and unbreak the broken system?
Yeah, I think that at a very practical level, it starts with just building relationships. And you may say, well, gosh, that's so simplistic. Like, why didn't anybody think of that before? But having been there now for 7 going on 8 years and having lived through this, at a very practical level, I have experienced how progress is possible, productivity is possible, when you just reach out to members of Congress, colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and treat each other with respect. Just reach out as people. Say, hey, I'm Tulsi. How are you? This is where I'm from. These are the issues that I care about, without going through all of the partisan filters and judgments that really hold sway on a day-to-day basis. I did this very early on as a newly elected member of Congress. I asked my mother to make 434 boxes of macadamia nut toffee for every single one of my new colleagues. I'm a freshman Democrat, newly elected, coming in. I didn't really know very many people. Republicans were in the majority. And I was told, as a freshman Democrat, you're never going to be able to pass legislation because they won't let you. And that was unacceptable to me. That's not why I ran for Congress. And so I started out by doing that, by giving these gifts of aloha to all of my colleagues, along with personal, just handwritten notes saying, hi, I'm Tulsi. I'm from Hawaii. This is who I am. I look forward to serving with you. And almost immediately, I started getting responses from people on the House floor doing votes. People who, as a freshman Democrat, I normally would not have had the chance to go and meet with the chairman of the Appropriations Committee or the Transportation. People who I normally would not have crossed paths with were coming up and just saying, thank you so much. Oftentimes saying, I ate all the candy, I need more to take home to my family this weekend. and then most importantly saying, hey, tell me what's going on in your district. What are some of the issues that you want to try to work on? Let's find a way to work together. And that, first 6 years in a Republican majority, I passed my very first bill that I introduced as a member of Congress into law. Passed amendments to bills that many people said would be impossible because others had tried and failed, but it opened those doors so that when those votes were about to take place, that I could pick up the phone, get my phone calls returned, have real conversations with people based on a real person-to-person relationship where they knew what I was telling them was true. I wasn't going to try to screw them over, and that relationship of respect and trust had been established. Not every single person always went my way every time, but a lot of times people did. And I was able to, talk to the Rules Committee chair and get my bill on the floor for a vote when others had tried and failed. So it's taking that same approach to actually begin to reestablish those relationships from the get-go and not just say, okay, well, we're going to meet once and say that's it, but changing the norm in Washington where inviting leaders from Congress to the White House should no longer be breaking news. but it is, and it has been for a long time. Just as you all work together here, you sit around the table and you talk. That has to happen on a regular basis. And that's something I'm committed to doing as president. Leaders from both parties, away from Twitter and the spotlights and the cameras, actually just figuring out how are we going to make this work. That's the biggest thing on a practical level. And the legislative piece to this is we've got to really seriously reform the campaign finance laws as it relates to how much power the parties have when it comes to money. Have almost unlimited amounts of fundraising ability, whereas an individual member of Congress can raise $2,800 from an individual. It creates a disproportionate imbalance of power and giving the parties a lot of leverage to be able to, instead of encouraging members of Congress to vote their conscience and vote their district, get them to vote based on whatever the party agenda or partisan line may be.
So can you talk a little bit about the evolution of your policy, your views on LGBTQ rights?
Sure.
From where early in your career you were in opposition, and then you evolved and you're in support of those rights now.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how and why sort of that evolution happened for you?
Yeah, I think like a lot of Americans, over time it was my own life experiences that informed my views changing on these issues and really understanding what equality and justice for all really means at a practical level, especially for our government and someone in our government fighting for equality and justice for all. And that's what I've done. And I've had people come to my town halls and say, well, I saw, the conservative views you held, when I was in my early 20s versus the views that I hold today. How can we believe you? And what I tell them is, look at my record. Actions speak louder than words. And throughout my time in Congress, I have upheld my commitment to fighting for equality in the workplace, in housing, in education, in fighting for safer schools for our kids, and making sure that we as a country are doing all that we can to finally bring about an end to discrimination that unfortunately our LGBTQ Americans are still facing.
Were there other areas that you had sort of an evolution like that from when you were in your 20s and probably a lot more conservative than you are now?
This is obviously a pretty significant one.
Sure, yeah.
Learned a lot and grown a lot. I think one of the biggest areas that deeply impacted my life was just serving in Iraq in 2005 during the height of the war. Going from Hawaii and experiencing and witnessing the attacks on 9/11, like a lot of people across the country, that tremendously impacted my life. I had not thought about joining the military before that. And it was that event that really drove me to make that decision in my life, that somehow I wanted to dedicate my life to protecting the safety, security, and freedom of the American people. Eventually it drove me to enlist in the Army National Guard. And I was closing out my first term in the State House at that time when our brigade combat team was activated for a deployment to Iraq. I was not on the mandatory deployment roster. They had somebody who was already doing the job that I was trained to do in a medical unit. But I knew there was no way that I could stay home. And so I stopped my re-election campaign, got trained in a different job they needed filling, and volunteered for that deployment. That really, it changed my life tremendously. I came home from that first deployment to Iraq unable to go back to the life that I had left behind. I didn't feel like I could run for State House again. I really wanted to try to find a way that I could take those experiences that I had. I was in a medical unit every day. The first thing I did was go through a name-by-name list of American casualties that had occurred in the previous 24 hours. And to go through that list, try to find, were there soldiers there from our brigade combat team? Were they getting the care that they needed? And in such a heart-wrenching way, witnessing that terribly high human cost. So when I came home, I didn't know exactly how, but I wanted to find a way to be able to make a positive impact. Ended up working as a legislative aide for one of our U.S. senators from Hawaii who was chairing the U.S. Senate Veterans Affairs Committee at that time, and was able to bring kind of those real-time experiences of having just come home, gone through this transition assistant programs, to the decisions that he was making, where the VA kind of bureaucracy and leadership in Washington is unfortunately, disconnected to the boots on the ground experience and perspective, and worked there with him until I volunteered for my second deployment.
So just to follow up on something you mentioned,
Yeah.
inequality. So
Yeah.
here we are in 2020, and so much inequality still persists, whether it's race, gender, so many other
Yes.
groups, types of things. So what's your take on what a president should do to kind of combat this inequality that's persisted for so long?
I think it's working with Congress to be able to pass legislation to correct some of the institutional inequalities, racism, income inequality, the gender pay gap, many of these issues that unfortunately, even as some legislation has been passed, maybe is not being applied or enforced. I think it's working with Congress within the constructs of passing legislative fixes, but I think in a broader way, I think it's leading by example. Making sure that as I select my cabinet, it's a cabinet that reflects the diversity of our country. It's making sure that we're bringing these diverse experiences and voices to the forefront so that the American people across our country can feel like our leadership is one that actually is representative of them. I think it's setting that expectation for the private sector in our society to recognize that we all have to do better.
This is a little bit switching gears.
Sure.
But a somewhat important topic to many of the people in this race is the effects of climate change.
Yes.
And so I think every candidate has spoken on the topic. Some are more deeply out there in terms of this is the thing, and we have to deal with, and others are this is a thing we certainly have to deal with. But in every case, dealing with it would entail some kind of change.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I would have about that in terms of how you view dealing with climate is what do you see in terms of the public expenditure on that? How much capital should the U.S. government be putting into trying to address that?
I'm not big on arbitrary numbers. I think it's more important for us first to look at, right now we're spending something like $30 billion every year to subsidize fossil fuel industry. We need to take those dollars and invest them instead in, the innovations we're seeing around clean renewable energy. Look at, there's a lot that's happening in the private sector that's driving this. Look at what more we can invest to be able to help speed up these advances and applications, across the country and supporting local governments in doing that. We've got a great example in Hawaii right now. On the island of Kauai, they have an energy co-op, and our state has set a goal of 100% renewable energy by 2045. And this county of Kauai is already far exceeding that timeline with the investments that they're making in solar and other forms of energy. So I think it's looking at what's necessary and building the partnerships to be able to make those necessary investments as it pertains to energy. Agriculture is another major area that is not often focused on enough, I think, as we're looking at the impacts of climate change and the environmental threats that exist, given the farm bill that's passed every 5 years very disproportionately benefits archaic farming practices of the past, monocrops, large multinational corporations, rather than looking at, hey, how do we better use taxpayer dollars to incentivize, more local and regional farming, regenerative farming, which is not only more sustainable but has the ability to recapture carbon that's already in the environment. Really focus on nutrition, helping people make better informed choices, both for their own health and well-being, but also we're seeing more and more how those who are choosing to have more of a plant-based diet can have a tremendously positive impact on the environment and on the impacts that our lifestyles are having on the environment. I think the fires in the Amazon were a wake-up call to a lot of people. We're saying, oh my gosh, this is the lungs of the world that are being burned down. And then once you start seeing, well, why? What is this? And what have they been doing to destroy the Amazon for so long? It comes back to, Brazil is the #1 beef exporter in the world. So there's a broader look we've got to take here if we're really serious about addressing climate change, which I think we must be. And the third thing I'll say on that is just that even if we do every single thing that we must to move us in that direction, it only barely scratches the surface to the coordinated global response that's necessary. And I think this is just one of many of the examples of why foreign policy is domestic policy, of how leading with the foreign policy based on cooperation rather than conflict is necessary to be able to work with other countries, even with those whom we may have differences, to be able to recognize that areas of shared and common interest like climate change require us working very closely together to address it. So I think it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Re-entering the Paris Climate Accords is necessary, but I think everyone is well aware that that was just a very small first step in the right direction.
So when you talk about renewable forms of energy,
Yeah.
clean, renewable, is nuclear one of those?
Nuclear, as we know it, in my view, no. And this is where I differ from some of the other candidates who are actively pushing for nuclear power to be a central part of that. And really there's a few reasons why. Number one is it's incredibly expensive. Number two, it's very slow. And I think worst of all, the risk and the waste that is left behind because of this nuclear power poses such a great threat to the communities who have to host these nuclear power plants that we can't afford that risk. I think that the big red flag always goes up when they're looking at building new nuclear power plants is that these companies building them can't insure it themselves because that risk is too high and they have to look to the federal government, taxpayers, to be able to provide that insurance protection for them.
And so there is that waste. We have a nuclear plant not far from here.
Yeah.
That has been shut down, decommissioned, it's being turned into some nice thing that eventually I guess will be office space or something. But in the meantime, it has tons of spent nuclear rods
Yes.
sitting in caskets that have no place to go. And that is on the federal government,
Yeah.
which is supposed to provide that.
Exactly. I think that's kind of the whole point.
What do you think needs to happen with all of that waste in these various places around? Is a central repository like Yucca Mountain, if not specifically Yucca Mountain, but something like that, the answer? Or is there maybe some other idea you have?
I think this exact challenge is why I feel so strongly we need a moratorium on any new nuclear power plants being built, because for so long now our country and the federal government has failed to address this problem. A central repository has been put forward as a possible solution, or potentially regional ones. I think it's one that we have to solve. The problem is that we've seen with some of the quote unquote temporary solutions that have been put forward is they're often put forward in communities that really are not interested in hosting them. And where was the last one that I had read about? I think in New Mexico, the Native American community would be the one most negatively impacted, and they're up in arms saying, no, we don't want it, and yet being told, well, you don't really have a choice in the matter. There's a lot of private interests that are driving the decision making on this, rather than one that's really about how do we best secure this waste so that it doesn't pose a threat to people, whether it's within regions or one central repository. But this is an urgent issue that we've got to address, because all it takes is one accident, and then you'll see an entire community really detrimentally impacted.
We have time for one more question.
Go ahead. We need to get a
so-
little bit more into.
So we'll wrap on foreign policy.
Sure.
So your campaign messaging is always, you come down to the phrase regime change wars.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you can unpack that, and what's that in a distinction from? Like, what are the other kind of wars?
Yeah, this is a really important question, because you hear a lot of talk about, well, I'm against endless wars. What does that actually mean? And the war against terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda that really began after the attack on 9/11 is distinct from the regime change wars, the many regime change wars that have been waged in the wake of 9/11. Toppling Saddam Hussein, going and toppling Muammar Gaddafi, the effort to topple the Assad government in Syria. You see different efforts, whether they are through the use of kind of a modern day siege tactics like sanctions, covert action through the CIA or others, or direct military action. So I think it's important to make that distinction between the two. One, this threat that is posed to our country from terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS unfortunately still exists, and unfortunately has gotten worse largely because of these other regime change wars that have been waged, unnecessarily undermining our national security and creating an environment for these terrorist groups to thrive, leaving us in a place now where we are almost 20 years past the attacks on 9/11, and Al-Qaeda is stronger today than they were when they launched those attacks.
Yeah, and I remember for the first time we spoke, I remember you saying that your meeting with Bashar al-Assad hasn't come up a lot with voters, but it is a big question I think a lot of people have when they're getting down to primary day, wanting to decide. So I was wondering, when you have, I do. I think when I talk to voters and they haven't heard about it before, it's a confusing thing. There's obviously a lot online. So while you're here, how did it happen? And when you're in formats where someone like Chris Matthews just says, like, will you call Assad a war criminal, and you don't, can you explain why that's sort of stuck?
Yeah, sure. First of all, the only alternative to diplomacy is war, and I am personally committed to ensuring that I exercise all diplomatic measures before seeing war as a last result, making sure that we do all that we can to prevent unnecessary loss of life by my brothers and sisters in uniform is paramount. And so, I had been very focused on the issue of this regime change war in Syria, was invited to go and visit there to hear from the people in Syria directly by Congressman Dennis Kucinich, who had been there before. And when we got there, we were invited to go and actually sit and meet with the president of Syria, Assad, and was able to have a very frank conversation on a whole host of issues. I think this practice of diplomacy is something that unfortunately is being seen as a bad thing in Washington. If you're going and meeting with a dictator, you're going and meeting with an adversary, when how else can you make progress towards a peaceful resolution to a situation if you're not willing to do that?
Yeah.
And I think President Obama said it best back in 2008 when he was running for president. He said very clearly, as distinct, I think, from Hillary Clinton at that time, that he would be willing to meet with the leaders of Iran, of North Korea, of Syria, and Russia, I think a whole host of other countries, recognizing that importance of diplomacy. I think that there are legal constructs in place for war criminals, the International Criminal Court. I think these things are not just a matter of, well, here's what I think, what do you think? I mean, there's a very specific reason for that. And I think at the forefront of all of this has to be, how are we best making decisions that serve our country's national security interests and the interests of the American people? It's not about, unfortunately, what we've seen Donald Trump doing lately. Well, General Soleimani, he was a bad guy. We took out a bad guy. We cannot have a commander-in-chief who's making these emotional decisions, just picking and choosing which bad guys in the world to take out, rather than making the decision based on having foresight, experience, understanding in national security and foreign policy, and what the consequences of these decisions are, and most importantly, how they affect the interests of the American people.
So, I mean, how did you have that discussion pertaining to, like, sarin gas when, I mean, there's video of kids, unable to breathe because of what this guy did to his own people? I mean, how did you tackle that, and how would a future president or in your White House approach something that heinous?
I think it's important, first of all, to make sure that we get the facts. And I think that's what, when President Trump launched 2 military attacks against Syria without congressional authorization, violating the Constitution, he did so without evaluating all of the evidence. I served in a war where I believed our leaders and our president, who told us, well, here's the evidence, they have weapons of mass destruction, they're going to give them to Al-Qaeda, so we're going to go to war. I had no reason not to believe them as a young soldier who really looked up to people like Hillary Clinton and to people who I believe would not lie to the American people. Yet they did. And so I think it's every leader's responsibility to make sure that we are very careful and that we examine all of the evidence before making these decisions. There has been, I think, 3 or 4 reports that have come from the investigators from the UN responsible in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, whistleblowers who reported one thing to their bosses and their reports never saw the light of day. And the final report that was issued was not only not complete, but directly contradicted the information, the evidence that was gathered on the ground. So again, I think this points to being responsible as leaders to gather the evidence before we make decisions and make sure that those decisions actually uphold the interests of our country.
Sure. I mean, we don't have to debate the UN report, but, like, who would have used them if it wasn't him?
I mean, are you aware of all of the different players who were there in Syria?
I've read quite extensively about the issue, but I do wonder. I think that there was pretty conclusive evidence that this is a practice that people were worried he would do, and that he did do, and there were the eyewitness accounts. And I mean, yes, it is a complicated issue. You have all these strange actions.
There are many different terrorist organizations there. There are obviously the opposition to the Syrian government. There's so many different entities who are operating there in Syria. My point is, and it's not saying, well, this happened and that didn't. My point is that evidence has to drive the decisions that are being made. We cannot have a commander-in-chief who's making emotional decisions, because those decisions, as again we've seen play out with the situation with Iran, directly undermine our country's national security interests in very significant ways.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
for
Yeah.
coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.